welcome to Positive Read-Ins. At the end of last year, 2022, the great US poet Charles Simic passed away. Charles Simic was born in the former Yugoslavia, but spent most of his adult life in New Hampshire. His poetry often writes about growing up either in a war-torn country or as an immigrant in the US. His poetry often has a philosophical perspective, but a humorous one, and is very accessible. I discovered his poetry later in life, but I've come to really enjoy it, and today I wanted to share a very brief survey of his work to kind of celebrate his work and his life. I'm going to start with one of the first poems that I read, coming from his early work. This poem is called Ax, that's A-X. So this is the first poem I read that really just captured my attention, pulled me in. Like, as I said, it's very accessible, and it's something that it's easy to read, yet it has definitely some deeper ideas going on beneath the language, the fairly simple language. So here we go. Ax. Whoever swings an axe knows the body of man will again be covered with fur. The stench of blood and swamp water will return to its old resting place. They'll spend their winters sleeping like the bears. The skin on the breasts of their women will grow coarse. He who cannot grow teeth will not survive. He who cannot howl will not find his pack. These dark prophecies were gathered unknown to myself by my body, which understands historical probabilities, lacking itself, in its essence, a future. So that's a fairly simple poem, 2 stanzas. The first one is presenting an apocalyptic prophecy. I imagine, like a lot of poems, this one begins with a simple action. Maybe Charles Simic himself cutting wood, and then suddenly has an epiphany. So in this regards, it reminds me a lot of Robert Frost poetry, where you have kind of the poet walking through a winter landscape, describing what he's seeing, and then suddenly have an epiphany about life and oftentimes death, and bringing that in here. So here we got a man, say, cutting some wood, suddenly has this prophecy that, we're gonna have this an overturn of society, overturn of civilization, and go back to kind of primitive ways. So that's essentially the premise of the poem, which certainly is an attractive premise, but it's that second stanza, the last one, that I find the most interesting. These dark prophecies were gathered unknown to myself by my body, which understands historical probabilities, lacking itself, in its essence, a future. So this idea that the body can sense things that the mind, or is aware of things, intuit things that the mind itself is not aware of. That, again, is that light philosophical kind of flavor that he has to these poems. In some ways, these remind me of the lyrics, too, of Isaac Brock of Modest Mouse, this kind of backyard philosopher, simple language, kind of philosophical look on things that are happening in life. The next poem is called Stone. This is probably the first one I think I heard of from Charles Simic. It has a playful note or playful tone, like many of these poems do, yet also dealing with fairly serious topics. So in this case, reincarnation, in part. So here we go, Stone. Go inside a stone, that would be my way. Let somebody else become a dove, or gnash with a tiger's tooth. I am happy to be a stone. From the outside, the stone is a riddle. No one knows how to answer it. Yet within, it must be cool and quiet, even though a cow steps on it full weight, even though a child throws it in a river. The stone sinks, slow, unperturbed, to the river bottom, where the fishes come to knock on it and listen. I have seen sparks fly out when 2 stones are rubbed, or perhaps it is not dark inside after all. Perhaps there is a moon shining from somewhere, as though behind a hill, just enough light to make out the strange writings, the star charts on the inner walls. So let someone else become a dove. I think the scenario here is that you can kind of choose what your afterlife is going to be, and the persona of this poem, presumably Charles Simic, is choosing kind of the odd choice of, I'm going to become a stone, this thing that we take for granted, that, no feeling, no life in it, but it has some good qualities, and then goes on to try to find what those qualities are. Part of this reminds me of, and I'm sure there's a reference here to William Blake's The Clod and the Pebble, right? We even have the stepping on the stone, right? This, in that poem, that Blake poem, is the idea of seeing two different sides of love, kind of a soft bending kind, and kind of a more of an authoritarian, hard version of it. And I think it's a similar notion here, this idea that we are, your afterlife is going to be either more or less kind of obtrusive on the world than your current life. And so as the stone, you're just kind of there. You can handle all the difficulties that come into the world, and but you're just protected from them. But and then of course we get this idea that is also maybe inside the stone there's light. There's things going on in there that we're not aware of. This would be an element, I think, definitely of kind of surrealism, which at one point in Mr. Simic's life, he thought of himself as a surrealist poet. So I think that could be some elements that we get there with that. Charles Simic is probably most famous for this book here, which is called The World Doesn't End. This won the 1990 Pulitzer Prize. It's a collection of prose poems. So they're written not in verse or meter, it's written in prose, just as the prose poem suggests. And a lot of these poems deal with either being an immigrant in America or being a young child in kind of a city at war and living through poverty. So it makes for some very, very interesting reading. Again, always kind of humorous, always taking a kind of a strange look at life. I want to focus here on one particular, and what comes out of section 2, which is essentially a character, again, assuming it's the poet, it's an immigrant, watching another immigrant at work. So here we go. Oh, and it begins with a Dear Friedrich, which I believe is addressing Friedrich Nietzsche, because this comes up again later when he refers to, he quotes Nietzsche, and then he refers to him again as Friedrich. So kind of addressed to the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And Simic, as you'll see if you go through and read a lot of his work, he has a great interest in philosophy. Dear Friedrich, the world still false, cruel, and beautiful. Earlier tonight, I watched the Chinese laundryman, who doesn't read or write our language, turn the pages of a book left behind by a customer in a hurry. That made me happy. I wanted it to be a dream book or a volume of foolishly sentimental verses, but I didn't look closely. It's almost midnight now, and his light is still on. He has a daughter who brings him dinner, who wears short skirts and walks with long strides. She's late, very late. So he has stopped ironing and watches the street. If not for the two of us, there'd be only spiders hanging their webs between the streetlights and the dark trees. So one of the things I really like about this poem is, like Samuel Beckett's work, it has this quick change of emotions. It starts off being, kind of playful. Okay, right into a philosopher. The world's still false, cruel, beautiful. That kind of sets us up for what we're going to get in this entire poem. We're going to see some, perhaps some cruelty, or at least a suggestion of it. But we're also going to get a beautiful moment. It kind of starts with the beautiful moment. So there's this Chinese laundryman, doesn't understand the language, but he's picking up, looking through a book, and the other immigrant who's watching him kind of gets some pleasure from this, as maybe anyone would when you see someone pick up maybe something that they don't quite understand, that could be but a desire to understand it and kind of look through it, right? That curiosity that people have, it is kind of one of the great things in life, to see people pursuing knowledge and pursuing curiosity, and that's what we have here. But then that quickly changes, and this is where I would say it has the Beckett connection, where you can go from something humorous to quickly something dark. It's almost midnight now. His light is still on. He has a daughter who brings him dinner, who wears short skirts and walks with long strides. So that short skirts, long strides, we get the idea that maybe this is an attractive daughter. And because of that, maybe other people are finding her attractive. Other people are watching her, and perhaps she's in danger because of that. Because she hasn't showed up. She's late. So he's worried, and he stops ironing, and he's looking out. So and it brings us in as the reader. We're worried. Oh yeah, what did happen to her? Again, there's nothing there to suggest besides the skirt and the long strides in human nature, but it gets us thinking that, okay, maybe something happened to her. We don't know. And so that's our false and cruel world there. It comes in, and then it ends again with another, maybe we could call this beautiful moment of, the Chinese laundryman who doesn't know he's being watched, still, just sitting there being watched by this other immigrant who, in a sense, is looking at this man as his mirror. He is experiencing the odd life, the isolated life of the immigrant for the viewer as well. So again, a lovely little moment. I think it's just a fragment of life that we get in this poem, but it's a moment I think packed with feeling, and that's what you get through a lot of the poems in this collection. So related to that, or related to poetry, I also wanted to talk a little bit about Charles Simic's essays. So he wrote a number of essays as well. This collection has a lot of really great essays. They're short. Just like his poetry, he tends to write in a very simple style, but he's taken on complex ideas. And in this, there's this essay here called Notes on Poetry and Philosophy, where he gives his view of the poem writing process. So I find this very interesting, both for a reader of poetry, but also anyone who's interested in writing, because he or even just the nature of art, because he comments on that here. So I just want to read this part here called The Fish. The fish is the phoenix to the cat. There is a major misunderstanding in literary criticism as to how ideas get into poems. The poets, supposedly, proceed in one of these two ways. They either state the ideas directly, or they find equivalents for them. Which is usually called philosophical poetry, seems to be either a poetry of heightened eloquence or some variety of symbolism. In each case, the assumption is that the poet knows beforehand what he or she wishes to say, and the writing of the poem is the search for the most effective means of gussying up these ideas. If this were correct, poetry would simply repeat what has been thought and said before. There would be no poetic thinking in the way Heidegger conceives of it. There would be no hope that poetry could have any relation to truth. So one of the things I find fascinating about this is that the ideas that he's bringing out here is that the poem itself, or the short story, or the painting, or the music piece, almost has a life of its own. It kind of dictates what the creator does more than the creator dictates its making. And this is repeated by many artists that talk about how they don't understand where their inspiration came from. They said it was almost as dictation. They just sat down and it came out. Simic in this case is saying that's the case with poetry. He puts it another way. A few sections later, he says, when it first happened, I was horrified, meaning when the poem kind of took over him. And he says, it took me years to admit that the poem is smarter than I am. Now I go where it wants to go. So I thought this was, again, a really fascinating view of the process of creating art, and the fact that the artist themselves is almost like just channeling some kind of inspiration to create a piece. It's not so much they're doing. And I think this is an important way of looking at art, because often today we put too much emphasis on who the artist is, who the creator is. Do we like this person? Do we like the thing they say? Have they said something too inappropriate, or should we cancel them, right? Whereas this is really separating the art from the artist. And let's just look at the art, because really the art was maybe just using the artist briefly for that creation. And I think you can see this perspective throughout Charles Simic's poetry, this kind of free feeling of just I'm just following this idea wherever it goes through this verse. All right, the last poem I'd like to end with is called Charles Simic. So I thought this would be an appropriate one to end on. We'll end with Charles Simic making a poem about himself, and in some case too, even speaking about the end, death. So here we go, Charles Simic. Charles Simic is a sentence. A sentence has a beginning and an end. Is he a simple or compound sentence? It depends on the weather. It depends on the stars above. What is the subject of the sentence? The subject is your beloved Charles Simic. How many verbs are there in the sentence? Eating, sleeping, and fucking are some of its verbs. What is the object of the sentence? The object, my little ones, is not yet in sight. And who is writing this awkward sentence? A blackmailer, a girl in love, and an applicant for a job. Will they end with a period or a question mark? They'll end with an exclamation point and an ink spot. And that's where we'll end. So if you enjoyed this poetry, please go and check out more of Charles Simic's work. I think it's really worth it. He's an interesting voice, and he'll give you an interesting perspective on life. Thank you for watching Positive Readings. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe. Reading and writing are choices. Let's make them.